Kenya's economy is market-based with a few state-owned infrastructure enterprises and maintains a liberalized external trade system. The country is generally perceived as Eastern and Central Africa's hub for financial, communication and transportation services. Major industries include agriculture, forestry and fishing, mining and minerals, industrial manufacturing, energy, tourism and financial services. As of 2015 estimates, Kenya had a GDP of $69,977, making it the 72nd largest economy in the world. Per capita GDP was estimated at $1,587. The government of Kenya is generally investment-friendly and has enacted several regulatory reforms to simplify both foreign and local investment, including the creation of an export processing zone. The export processing zone is expected to grow rapidly through input of foreign direct investment. An increasingly significant portion of Kenya's foreign inflows are remittances by non-resident Kenyans who work in the US, Middle East, Europe and Asia. Compared to its neighbors, Kenya has well-developed social and physical infrastructure. As of March 2014, economic prospects were positive with above 5% GDP growth expected, largely because of expansions in telecommunications, transport, construction and a recovery in agriculture. These improvements are supported by a large pool of English-speaking professional workers. There is a high level of computer literacy, especially among the youth. Economic history. After its independence, Kenya promoted rapid economic growth through public investment, encouragement of smallholder agricultural production, and incentives for private, often foreign industrial investment. Gross domestic products grew at an annual average of 6.6% from 1963 to 1973. Agricultural production grew by 4.7% annually during the same period, stimulated by redistributing estates, diffusing new crop strains, and opening new areas to cultivation. Between 1974 and 1990, however, Kenya's economic performance declined. Kenya's inward-looking policy of import substitution and rising oil prices made Kenya's manufacturing sector uncompetitive. The government began a massive intrusion in the private sector. Lack of export incentives, tight import controls, and foreign exchange controls made the domestic environment for investment even less attractive. From 1991 to 1993, Kenya had its worst economic performance since independence. Growth in GDP stagnated, and agricultural production shrank at an annual rate of 3.9%. Inflation reached a record 100% in August 1993, and the government's budget deficit was over 10% of GDP. As a result of these combined problems, bilateral and multilateral donors suspended program aid to Kenya in 1991. Throughout these first 3 decades of independence, Kenya's parastatals, partly from a lack of expertise and endemic corruption, largely inhibited economic development. In 1979, a presidential commission went as far as saying that they constituted a serious threat to the economy. A decade later, they had still not furthered industrialization or fostered the development of a black Kenyan business class, the backbone of the country's private sector success was provided by Asian Kenyans. During the colonial period, it was they who had created their country's internal market, and then dominated internal trade. British colonizers instituted segregation based on skin color. Whites were first-class citizens, Indians. As part of this program, the government eliminated price controls and import licensing, removed foreign exchange controls, privatized a range of publicly owned companies, reduced the number of civil servants, and introduced conservative fiscal and monetary policies. From 1994 to 1996, Kenya's real GDP growth rate averaged just over 4% a year. In 1997, however, the economy entered a period of slowing or stagnant growth. due in part to adverse weather conditions and reduced economic activity prior to general elections in December 1997. In July 1997, the government of Kenya refused to meet commitments made earlier to the IMF on governance reforms. As a result, the IMF suspended lending for 3 years, and the World Bank also put a $90 million structural adjustment credit on hold. The government of Kenya took positive steps on reform, including the 1997 establishment of the Kenya Anti-Corruption Authority, and measures to improve the transparency of government procurements and reduce the government payroll. In July 2000, the IMF signed a $150 million poverty reduction and growth facility, and the World Bank followed suit shortly after with a $157 million economic and public sector reform credit. This is a chart of trend of gross domestic product of Kenya at market prices estimated by the International Monetary Fund, with figures in millions of Kenyan shillings. Small-scale businesses are providing more and more jobs in Kenya. With increased but simplified regulations, they are able to blossom into large, legitimate businesses that can eventually create more jobs and government revenue. Gross domestic product. In 2006, Kenya's gross domestic product was about $17.39 billion. Per capita GDP averages somewhat more than $450 annually. Adjusted in purchasing power parity terms, per capita GDP in 2006 was about $1,200. The country's real GDP growth picked up to 2.3% in early 2004 and to nearly 6% in 2005 and 2006. Compared with a sluggish 1.4% in 2003 and throughout President Daniel Arap Moi's last term. Real GDP is expected to continue to improve, largely because of expansions in tourism, telecommunications, transport, and construction, and a recovery in agriculture. The Kenya Central Bank forecast for 2007 is between 5 and 6% GDP growth. GDP composition by sector, according to 2004 estimates, was as follows: agriculture 25.7%, manufacturing 14.0%, trade, restaurants, and hotels 13.8%, transport and communications 6.9%, government services 15.6%, and other 24.0%. Agriculture, industry and manufacturing, and services GDP growth. Agriculture. In 1980, agriculture accounted for 33% of Kenya's overall GDP. In 1990, the value agriculture added to GDP was 30%. In 2000, it increased to 32%, and in 2011, and the value agriculture added to overall GDP fell to 23%. Industry and manufacturing. In the last 31 years, this component of Kenya's GDP has been greatly fluctuating. In 1980, industry and manufacturing accounted for 21% of Kenya's overall GDP. In 1990, it decreased to 19%, and in 2000, the value added to GDP decreased again to 17%. In 2011, there was a slight rise to 19% of Kenya's overall GDP. Services. The World Bank defines services as jobs that are included in wholesale and retail, trade, transport, government, financial, professional, and personal services. In 1980, services accounted for 47% of Kenya's overall GDP. In 1990, it accounted for 51%. In 2000, it stayed constant at 51%, and in 2011, the services sector accounted for 58% of Kenya's overall GDP. Industries. Agriculture. The agricultural sector continues to dominate Kenya's economy. Although only 15% of Kenya's total land area has sufficient fertility and rainfall to be farmed, and only 7 or 8% can be classified as first-class land. In 2006, almost 75% of working Kenyans made their living on the land, compared with 80% in 1980. About one-half of total agricultural output is non-marketed subsistence production. Agriculture is the second-largest contributor to Kenya's gross domestic product, after the service sector. In 2005, agriculture, including forestry and fishing, accounted for about 24% of GDP, as well as for 18% of wage employment and 50% of revenue from exports. The principal cash crops are tea, horticultural produce, and coffee. Horticultural produce and tea are the main growth sectors and the two most valuable of all of Kenya's exports. In 2005, horticulture accounted for 23% and tea for 22% of total export earnings. Coffee has declined in importance with depressed world prices, accounting for just 5% of export receipts in 2005. The production of major food staples such as corn is subject to sharp weather-related fluctuations. The downturns periodically necessitate food aid. For example, in 2004, aid for 1.8 million people because of one of Kenya's intermittent droughts. However, the expansion of credit to the agricultural sector has enabled farmers to better deal with the large risk of agriculture based on rainfall and the dramatic fluctuations of the prices of agricultural products. Tea, coffee, sisal, pyrethrum, corn, and wheat are grown in the fertile highlands, one of the most successful agricultural production regions in Africa. Livestock predominates in the semi-arid savanna to the north and east. Coconuts, pineapples, cashew nuts, cotton, sugarcane, sisal, and corn are grown in the lower-lying areas. Forestry and fishing. Resource degradation has reduced output from forestry. In 2004, roundwood removals came to 22,162,000 cubic meters. Fisheries are of local importance around Lake Victoria and have potential on Lake Turkana. Kenya's total catch reported in 2004 was 128,000 metric tons. However, output from fishing has been declining because of ecological disruption. Pollution, overfishing, and the use of unauthorized fishing equipment have led to falling catches and have endangered local fish species. Mining and minerals. Kenya has no significant mineral endowment. The mining and quarrying sector makes a negligible contribution to the economy, accounting for less than 1% of gross domestic product. The majority contributed by the soda ash operation at Lake Magadi in south-central Kenya. Thanks largely to rising soda ash output, Kenya's mineral production in 2005 reached more than 1 million tons. One of Kenya's largest foreign investment projects in recent years is the planned expansion of Magadi Soda. Apart from soda ash, the chief minerals produced are limestone, gold, salt, large quantities of niobium, fluorspar, and fossil fuel. All unextracted minerals are government property, according to the Mining Act. Industry and manufacturing. Although Kenya is the most industrially developed country in East Africa, manufacturing still accounts for only 14% of gross domestic product. This level of manufacturing GDP represents only a slight increase since independence. Expansion of the sector after independence, initially rapid, has stagnated since the 1980s, hampered by shortages in hydroelectric power, high energy costs, dilapidated transport infrastructure, and the dumping of cheap imports. However, due to urbanization, the industry and manufacturing sectors have become increasingly important to the Kenyan economy, and has been reflected by an increasing GDP per capita. Industrial activity, concentrated around the three largest urban centers, Nairobi, Mombasa, and Kisumu, is dominated by food processing industries such as grain milling, beer production, and sugarcane crushing, and the fabrication of consumer goods. e.g., vehicles from kits. Kenya also has an oil refinery that processes imported crude petroleum into petroleum products, mainly for the domestic market. In addition, a substantial and expanding informal sector engages in small-scale manufacturing of household goods, motor vehicle parts, and farm implements. About half of the investment in the industrial sector is foreign, with the United Kingdom providing half. The United States is the second largest investor. Kenya's inclusion among the beneficiaries of the U.S. government's African Growth and Opportunity Act has given a boost to manufacturing in recent years. Since AGO8 took effect in 2000, Kenya's clothing sales to the United States increased from $44 million to $270 million. Other initiatives to strengthen manufacturing have been the new government's favorable tax measures, including the removal of duty on capital equipment and other raw materials. Energy. The largest share of Kenya's electricity supply comes from hydroelectric stations at dams along the Upper Tana River, as well as the Turkwell Gorge Dam in the west, a petroleum-fired plant on the coast, geothermal facilities at Olkaria, and electricity imported from Uganda make up the rest of the supply. Kenya's installed capacity stood at 1,142 megawatts a year between 2001 and 2003. The state-owned Kenya Electricity Generating Company, established in 1997 under the name of Kenya Power Company, handles the generation of electricity, while the Kenya Power and Lighting Company, which is slated for privatization, handles transmission and distribution. Shortfalls of electricity occur periodically, when drought reduces water flow. In 1997 and 2000, for example, drought prompted severe power rationing, with economically damaging 12-hour blackouts. Frequent outages, as well as high cost, remain serious obstacles to economic activity. Tax and other concessions are planned to encourage investment in hydroelectricity and in geothermal energy, in which Kenya is a pioneer. The government plans to open 2 new power stations in 2008, Sondu Miriu and Olkaria IV, but power demand growth is strong, and demand is still expected to outpace supply during periods of drought. Kenya has recently found some hydrocarbon reserves on its semi-arid northern region of Turkana after several decades of intermittent exploration. Prospecting also continues off Kenya's shore. In the meantime, Kenya currently imports all crude petroleum requirements. Petroleum accounts for 20 to 25% of the national import bill. Kenya Petroleum Refineries, a 50-50 joint venture between the government and several oil majors, operates the country's sole oil refinery in Mombasa, which currently meets 60% of local demand for petroleum products. In 2004, oil consumption was estimated at 55,000 barrels a day. Most of the Mombasa refinery's production is transported via Kenya's Mombasa-Nairobi pipeline. Tourism. Kenya's services sector, which contributes about 63% of GDP, is dominated by tourism. The tourism sector exhibited steady growth in most years since independence and by the late 1980s had become the country's principal source of foreign exchange. In the late 1990s, tourism relinquished this position to tea exports because of a terrorism-related downturn. The downturn followed the 1998 bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi and later negative travel advisories from Western governments. Tourists, the largest number from Germany and the United Kingdom, are attracted to the coastal beaches and the game reserves, notably the expansive Tsavo East National Park and Tsavo West National Park in the southeast. The government and tourist industry organizations have taken steps to address security issues and to reverse negative publicity. Such steps include establishing a tourist police and launching marketing campaigns in key tourist origin markets. In 2006, tourism generated $803 million, up from $699 million the previous year. Financial services. Kenya is East and Central Africa's hub for financial services. The Nairobi Stock Exchange is ranked 4th in Africa in terms of market capitalization. The Kenya banking system is supervised by the Central Bank of Kenya. As of late July 2004, the system consisted of 43 commercial banks, several non-bank financial institutions, including mortgage companies, 4 savings and loan associations, and several foreign exchange bureaus. 2 of the 4 largest banks, the Kenya Commercial Bank and the National Bank of Kenya, are partially government-owned, and the other 2 are majority foreign-owned. Most of the many smaller banks are family-owned and operated.